Fishing is a hobby as old as time itself. Although today's world is advancing so quickly, the secrecy around fishing is one thing that has remained the same. How often have you tried to learn from friends or people online only to be met with answers like, "I caught this fish in the lake, I hooked it in the mouth," or "it bit my secret lure"? The majority of anglers are not willing to share their knowledge as they have spent their entire fishing career learning the spots, lures, and tricks that work for them. This makes it impossible for new anglers to join the sport and enjoy all fishing has to offer without a serious time commitment and steep learning curve. In today's world, the most powerful tool anyone can have is quality information. Success ultimately comes down to the decisions you make, and the difference between a good and bad decision is as simple as the quality of information you have available at the time. Our mission is to help you become a more successful angler by providing the knowledge you need and how to apply it to the situations you may encounter while fishing. Our To Hero Fishing Masterclass has been put together from over 25 years of focused and strategic fishing adventures. By completing this course, you will learn how to fish like a pro no matter where you fish by making smart, informed decisions without having to spend a lifetime on the water learning it. Before jumping into this module, be sure to complete the training courses listed here. The content in these courses outline the fundamental knowledge and concepts that will be needed to understand the content of this module. You can always refer back to these courses to refresh your knowledge if any of the content or conclusions are still unclear. We know you want to get catching fish fast, but having an understanding of the fundamentals will lead to you catching fish more consistently and make better decisions while on the water. Welcome to Module B5, Fishing Fundamentals Part 1 of 2. By completing this module, you will learn how to master the fundamentals of fishing. You will learn how to tie fishing knots, how to set up your rods, as well as casting and retrieval techniques. In Part 2 of this module, you will learn tips and tricks for detecting bites and fighting fish, how to properly handle the fish once you do catch them, and you'll also learn some tips and tricks for dealing with snags and how to remove hooks from your fish or yourself. Getting ready to buy your first rod and reel, and now you want to know how to set these up. The first thing that you're going to want to do, even before you finish purchasing that rod at the store, is to take a look at the eyelets. In these eyelets, there should be a ceramic ring inside that is used to protect the line as you're fishing with it. If there's any of these rings missing or there's chips and chunks out of the eyelets, get a different rod or bring the one that you have just purchased, bring it back and get a new one. These eyelets can't be replaced once they are damaged, and so you'll have to make some modifications to your rod in order to try to use it and get your money out of it. But they can't be replaced once they are damaged, so make sure that they are good to go before you buy that rod. Once you've picked your rod and your reel, the next thing to do is to start setting up. On the reel, you'll have the handle, and there's usually a screw type tab to lock the reel in place. So you want to loosen that off, slide the reel in place, and then tighten the screw down as much as you can in order to lock that rod in place. You might even want to grab a pair of pliers to add a little bit extra force to make sure that it's tight rather than just using your hand. Once it's in place, you're good to go, and we can start putting the line on. When you put line on your reel, you want to make sure it's tight so that tangles and knots can't happen while you're fishing. So what you're going to want to do is grab that spool of line, get a friend to help if possible, and get them to use some sort of tool to put through the center of the spool. That way they can hold on to it while it spins off, and they can put pressure on the spool as needed to make sure that it's coming off and you're pulling tight onto your rod. So to tie onto your rod, pull out a bunch of line, and we're going to go from the tip of the rod, feed the line through from the tip down to the reel. When you're doing this, make sure that you do actually go through the center of the eyelets and that you don't twist around the rod because that will break your rod when you're using it, and it's also going to chafe the line as you cast in and cast out. Some rods do have some extra holes in between where the eyelet attaches to the rod, so don't feed your line through there either. Make sure it does go through the center of the eyelet. Once you've got your line down to the reel, you're going to want to make sure you open your bail. If the bail's closed and you start putting line on, it's not a big deal. You're just going to have to cut the line and open it up and retie it. Not a huge deal. So once you open your bail, you're going to want to perform an arbor knot. Usually spin around the spool twice, and then go ahead and make that knot. Alright, once you've tied your knot on there, pull it tight and trim off any of the excess. If you do find that it's slipping around the spool, a small piece of tape can be put on there as well, and that will prevent it from slipping, and once you wind it up tight, it'll be nice and secure so that the drag can work. What you want to do next is close the bail and grab the line in between the spool and the first eyelet, and you want to pull that tight. Give it some tension so that as you start winding line in, it'll go on nice and tight. Once you've got 4 or 5 turns in and some line on the reel, double check your drag. It's better to do this now instead of at the end, because at the end you're going to have all your line on here, and the problem is going to be at that very first knot you tied. So you'll have to take all of the line off, so it's best just to check now. You want to loosen or tighten or loosen that drag up depending on how you've had it set, and then give it a pull to make sure that it does actually, the drag engages and starts coming off the rod. The spool itself will spin. If your drag isn't working, what will happen is the line will just spin on the spool, and the spool itself won't spin, and the line will just get tight. It'll cut into itself as you tighten it up and pull on it. You don't want this to happen. If you don't have a drag, it's a lot more difficult to fight fish. You're more likely to break off, and just overall not a good time. That's pretty much it. Once you have this, you've checked the drag, keep spooling, add as much line as you can. You shouldn't put so much line on it that it extends out over the spool. The spool should look about 75% full, so that it can you can cast and manage that line well. If it's too much line on it, it'll tend to fall off all the time, and this will lead to knots and tangles and waste all your time on the water. The only step left once you do fill up your whole line that I like to do is tie the end of my line to a tree, to a fence post, to the car hitch, whatever it is you have available to you, and open the bail up and walk until all the line is back out, and then I will close the bail and reel in, keeping a lot of pressure on the line as I move closer and back to where I tied the line off. This just is an added task to make sure that the line is on the spool evenly and that it's tight, just avoid tangles and so that the reel can manage the line better when you do get out on the water. You can, instead of doing this, you can also just put on a big crankbait or something that has a heavy lip and can provide some resistance. Once you do get on the water, drop it in the water, open your bail and let all the line come out, and then simply just reel that in. That'll make sure the line gets on tight as well, and smooth and even across the spool for those good results when you are using them.
Tying fishing knots are a fundamental skill every angler needs to know. Knots attach your line to the reel and your lure to the line. If you have bad knots, you're going to lose fish and lures, period. We know because we've been there, and it's not fun to have to retie lures or a full spool of line because of a bad knot. Not to mention the cost of losing brand new baits and fish that could have been your next PB. Luckily, you do not need to know all the knots that are out there. At New Wave Fishing Academy, we are able to do all of our fishing only knowing 4 basic knots, and you can too. The knots we use are the arbor knot for attaching line to spools, the Palomar knot for most applications and 100% of the time while using braided line, the fluorocarbon knot when using fluorocarbon or monofilament line to attach to lures and for drop shotting applications, and the double uni knot when tying a mono or fluorocarbon leader directly to another line. To tie an arbor knot, first loop the line around the spool in the direction it will be added when reeled in. If you do the opposite, this knot will not cinch to the spool properly and will prevent the drag from working. Next, simply tie an overhand knot around the main line. Next, tie a second overhand knot on your tag end. Pull the main line tight so both knots bind together on the spool. It's that simple. If the knots pull through, because you're using braided line or some thin mono or fluorocarbon, you can add a second overhand knot around the main line and multiple overhand knots on the tag end, and this should solve the problem. The Palomar knot is the most common knot fishermen use. It is very strong and easy to tie. To tie Palomar knot, start by folding your line back on itself so you have 6 to 8 inches of doubled up line. Put the looped end through the eyelet of your lure, hook, or snap, and while holding the doubled up line, tie an overhand knot around the doubled up main line. After this, simply toss your lure, hook, or snap back through the loop you've created. Wet the line and pull tight. You've got a Palomar knot. Trim off the excess main line and you're ready to go. The fluorocarbon knot is another easy knot anglers can tie and works best for mono or fluoro lines. Start by passing the tag end of your line through the eyelet. Pass it through the same side of the eyelet a second time, forming a loop. With the tag end, twist around the main line 3 to 6 times, and generally for thinner lines you'll want to wrap it at least 6 times or maybe even more. Pass the tag end back through the loop you created with the tag end and main line, as well as the loop around the eyelet. Once you've done this, wet the line and pull it tight. The double uni knot is used for tying one piece of line to another. It is a little more complicated, but is the most simple line-to-line knot that we've found. To tie a double uni knot, start by placing the tag ends of your 2 lines in parallel but in opposite directions from each other. With one of the lines, fold it backwards so the line is doubled. Twist around the main line and tag end of the other line as you move back towards the looped end. 4 to 6 wraps are recommended. Wet and pull tight. Now repeat this process with the other tag line. Once you've completed it, pull the 2 knots together and trim off the excess tag ends. You've now got 2 lines that are held together by a very strong knot. The fluorocarbon knot is another easy knot anglers can tie and works best for mono or fluoro lines. Start by passing the tag end of your line through the eyelet. Pass it through the same side of the eyelet a second time, forming a loop. With the tag end, twist around the main line 3 to 6 times, and generally for thinner lines you'll want to wrap it at least 6 times or maybe even more. Pass the tag end back through the loop you created with the tag end and main line, as well as the loop around the eyelet. Once you've done this, wet the line and pull it tight. The double uni knot is used for tying one piece of line to another. It is a little more complicated, but is the most simple line-to-line knot that we've found. To tie a double uni knot, start by placing the tag ends of your 2 lines in parallel but in opposite directions from each other. With one of the lines, fold it backwards so the line is doubled. Twist around the main line and tag end of the other line as you move back towards the looped end. 4 to 6 wraps are recommended. Wet and pull tight. Now repeat this process with the other tag line. Once you've completed it, pull the 2 knots together and trim off the excess tag ends. You've now got 2 lines that are held together by a very strong knot. Depending on the rod setup you've chosen, there may be some more work to do before you hit the water. For spinning rods, all you need to do is adjust the drag and you're all set. But for bait casting setups, there are a few more settings which need adjustment. Most of the complaints anglers have from bait casting reels is because they do not take the time to set it up correctly, which leads to backlashes, tangles, and an overall bad experience. The first setting to adjust is the spool tensioner. This is the amount of pressure that is put on the spool and controls how quickly the spool can spin. If the spool spins faster than your cast can pull the line out, you end up with a tangle. Alternatively, if the spool has so much pressure on it that it can't spin even with the lure pulling line out, you get a very short and inaccurate cast. The good news is you don't need to make major adjustments once you set it up for one lure unless the weight of the lure changes drastically. To adjust the spool tensioner, make sure your lure is tied on, open the bail, and allow the lure to fall towards the ground or water. The lure should free fall and the spool should stop once it hits the ground or water. If the bait does not free fall, loosen the spool tensioner by turning it counterclockwise, and if the spool does not stop when the bait hits the ground, tighten the tensioner by turning it clockwise. Once you become more comfortable with using a bait caster and how it performs, you can loosen the spool tensioner more to gain some casting distance, but you'll need to control the spool throughout the cast with your thumb to avoid backlashes. After adjusting the spool tensioner, the next setting is the braking system. This is used to adjust how the spool behaves throughout the cast. As you cast your lure, it will initially have a lot of energy and force to pull the line from the spool, but due to wind and air resistance, it'll slow down and have less force to pull line from the spool towards the end of the cast. If the spool isn't slowed, you will get a tangle. Normally this can be set right in the middle. However, if you are casting into the wind or with a really light lure or one that catches the air a lot like a spoon, you'll want to turn this up to avoid backlashes. Alternatively, if you're casting a very compact or heavy lure or with the wind, you can turn this down to gain casting distance. This setting should be adjusted continuously throughout the day to optimize performance.
When a lot of anglers do pick up their first bait casting rod, they expect it to be just like their spinning combo. They're hoping to just pick it up and use it. And while bait casters are a little harder to understand, they aren't that complicated. There's really only a few settings that you need to adjust before you go ahead and use them. This will avoid all the problems that anglers complain about with bait casters, like backlashes, knots, and not even be able to cast very far. There are a few settings on here compared to the spinning rod. Spinning rod just has your drag setting. On a bait caster, you have your drag, which is adjusted by this star pattern here. You have your spool tensioner, which is adjusted by this knob right here. And on the other side of the reel, you have your braking system. Now each one does something a little different. The drag is for fighting fish, and you probably already know about that, so we won't touch on that. The spool tensioner is how much pressure is put on the spool, and so how easily that line will come out when the bail is open. So this adjustment is the most important, and usually is why people have problems with bait casters and tend to get lots of tangles and knots, because they haven't adjusted this property correctly or at all. The braking system is another secondary adjustment that you can use to help get more casting distance and also to avoid backlashes when casting into the wind. The braking system slows down how fast your spool is spinning as the cast goes out. So as you cast your lure itself is going to be slowing down in the air, which means it's going to be pulling less line out from the reel slower. And if the spool itself doesn't also slow down at the same rate, then it's going to overrun your line and create a tangle, which can lead to your lure flying off, your line snapping, all kinds of issues, and as well just the pain of having to take out another knot from your line. So a couple settings that you do need to be aware of, and we'll go over how to do that. So the first one is your spool tension. This one's pretty easy to adjust. You turn clockwise and counterclockwise to add more or less tension onto the spool. And to test if this is right, all you do is open the bail and let something like your lure drop to the floor. So if we open this spool and we let this item drop to the ground, we can see that the spool stopped when it hit the ground, and so it's adjusted properly. But if this wasn't the case, if we reel in some more line, bring this back up, and we loosen this right off, we'll turn it counterclockwise to loosen it off. If we open the bail and let it hit the ground, you can see that the spool didn't stop right away and actually spun out a lot more line. This isn't what you want. You don't want this to happen. This is where the tangles typically come from. So if that is the case, what you do is tighten that up a little bit and repeat until you get the correct setting. On the other hand, if you have this tightened way too much and you open the bail, it's not even going to move or barely fall down. This is going to considerably reduce your casting distance and make it very difficult to cast accurately and even use it all. So this is too much. You're going to want to loosen that setting off a little bit. Keep repeating until the spool stops spinning as soon as that item hits the ground, and your settings are probably good. As you get better, you can loosen off the spool tensioner a little bit to get more casting distance out of it, but you will need to control the spool speed with your thumb instead. Always a good tip to grab the spool with your thumb as your bait hits the water to stop the spool and avoid tangles. As for the braking system, this is something that you want to continuously adjust throughout the day. It slows the spool down as you cast, and so if you're using something that's also really heavy and not likely to be impacted by the wind or slow down much throughout the cast because of its momentum, you can also turn this pretty much off. If you are using something that, like a spoon, that is going to catch the wind as you cast, it's going to slow down a considerable amount, you're going to want to turn this up. That way the spool won't overrun itself and you'll avoid tangles. If you are fishing with the wind, then you can lower this down as the wind is going to push your bait further and keep that speed up throughout the cast. But if you're fishing or casting into the wind, you're definitely going to want to crank this up a lot so that you can cast into the wind effectively without getting any tangles. This is something you can continually adjust throughout the day to try to optimize your performance, or you kind of get it set once and you can leave it at that and just do your best. It's really up to you, but that setting is also there and important to use, so if you do have it, make sure that you use it.
Casting is the act of tossing or throwing your lure into the water using the rod as a type of catapult. When it comes to casting, there are a number of ways you can accomplish this. The main goal is to put your lure where the fish can get to the bait, or to cover as much water as possible with your retrieve. Some of the various casting methods include overhand casts, which are great for distance but can have a big splash which may spook fish. Sidearm casts, which look cool, have an okay distance, and are needed in certain scenarios where overhand casting can be difficult or things are in the way. Underhand roll casts, they allow anglers to minimize splashing, require little room to execute, but are only good for short distances. Pitching is a great tool for short casts. It minimizes splashing and gives you very high accuracy to hit those small pockets. Some more advanced casting techniques include skipping and flipping, but these shouldn't be practiced until the others have been mastered, as they are only used in highly specific scenarios. We have some tips and instructions on how to perform each type of cast on the next few slides coming up. Pause the video to read through and get an idea for how these are performed. Then the next step is to practice. We won't discuss in detail these steps. We'll leave this up to you, and then we'll move on to some more content. Casting is the most fundamental skill all anglers need to master, and this requires practice. Although it's ideal to be on the water, you can practice your casting anywhere. Simply tie a 1/2 to 3/4 ounce weight onto your line without a hook and try to hit different targets you have set up. It could be a bucket, a cup, a wheelbarrow, anything that can help you give something a target to hit. Try different casting techniques and work on keeping the bait low to the water to minimize splash and improving your accuracy to hit those small points once you get on the water. When you're done, be sure to check your line for damage and cut out sections that are needed that have nicks or frays. You don't want to lose a fish or lure when you do get to the water because of this simple, or forgetting to check your line, or this simple mistake. Much to the surprise of a lot of new anglers, fishing is not just sitting and waiting. Most lures require the angler to perform a certain retrieve to give the bait action for optimal performance. Each lure has its own retrieve style that will produce the best results, but these can be narrowed down fairly easily. Unfortunately, the tackle companies don't tell you how to work the bait, so it's up to you to figure it out. We're here to help you with that. In general, in colder water or when the fish are inactive, it will require slower retrieves than in warm water or with more active fish. The most simple retrieve anglers can use is the straight retrieve. As the name suggests, a straight retrieve is simply retrieving the bait once it is cast out by turning the reel handle. This retrieve can be done at any depth or speed, but it's up to the angler to decide on this. At times, speeding up or slowing down the retrieve can trigger fish to bite. Similarly, adding a pause or two throughout the retrieve can also trigger fish to bite. When performing straight retrieve, the rod should be parallel to the water while the rod tip is pointed directly back at the bait. Alternatively, the rod tip can be pointed perpendicular to the bait, which will cause the rod to load up when a fish bites. Normally, for a straight retrieve, you'll range between 1 and 5 handle turns every second. The jerk pause retrieve technique is used with a number of different baits, but it's most popular with jerk baits, walking baits, poppers, and the occasional soft plastic. The jerk pause technique causes lures to dip and dart in erratic, unpredictable movements, and this action causes a reactionary strike from fish that think it's an injured bait fish that's getting away. To perform the jerk pause technique, position your rod parallel to the water with a small amount of slack in the line. Quickly snap the rod tip towards the water such that the line becomes tight about halfway through the snap. This will take some practice to ensure the right amount of slack is in the line, but once this is mastered, you can continue the retrieve by reeling in the slack and returning the rod tip parallel to the water. Keep repeating this process until the bait is back at the boat. When fish are very active, this retrieve can be done very quickly and cover a lot more water. But when the fish are inactive, increasing the length of the pauses, anywhere up to 3 to 10 seconds between jerks in extremely cold water, will help entice fish to bite. The typical cadences for the jerk pause retrieve are usually a simple jerk pause, jerk pause, followed by either two jerks and a pause, as well as just a simple one jerk, pause, another jerk, pause, etc. It's really up to the angler and what their preference is, but these are very common cadences. Popping is a retrieval technique for targeting fish relating to bottom. To pop a bait, position your rod tip at about the 3 o'clock position with a semi-tight line. If you quickly snap the rod tip up to the 2 o'clock position with a single or double pump, it will mimic the way crayfish or goby tend to flee from predators. Next, just reel in the slack line as you lower the rod tip back toward that 3 o'clock position, and the bait makes contact with bottom again. You repeat this until the bait is back at the boat. Variations of this technique can include pauses or shaking the bait at various points in the retrieve to add some additional action to the bait. When you're popping, it's a fairly fast retrieve, and a pop should happen about once every second. This is dependent again on the fish activity, and on any given day you may need to speed up or slow down the retrieve in order to get bit. Dragging is a retrieval technique that anglers can use with bottom contact baits. Dragging will keep the bait or weight, in the case if you're using a drop shot, in contact with the bottom at all times. This method is used for targeting inactive fish that will not chase baits up off the bottom, but it also imitates bottom-dwelling species like crayfish and gobies. To drag a bait, make sure the bait is in contact with bottom first, and let additional line out if needed. Position the rod tip at about the 4 o'clock position with semi-tight line, and slowly raise the rod tip towards the 2 o'clock position. Anglers should be able to feel the bottom with their bait or weight throughout the entire process. If you can't, you're either going too fast or snapping the rod too much. Once you've raised the rod to the 2 o'clock position, reel in the slack line as you lower the rod tip back towards the 4 o'clock position, and ensure the bait makes contact with the bottom at all times. Repeat this until the bait is back at the boat. Some variations can include shaking the bait at various points to add additional action. As well, you can perform a drag instead of lifting the rod tip up by pointing the rod tip directly at the bait and twisting at the hip while keeping the rod parallel to the water before pointing back towards the bait and reeling in the slack to perform another drag. You can practice popping and dragging at home to see with your eyes just how the bait responds. Try experimenting with different weights to see how this might work while you're off the water and can get an idea with your eyes. Although we've talked about fishing not being sitting and waiting, sometimes that's exactly what you need to do to get bit. Dead sticking is the term called for the retrieval technique when you're targeting very inactive fish. As the name suggests, dead sticking is a do-nothing approach. When dead sticking, anglers will cast their bait out, let it sink to bottom, and wait. Nothing else. That's it. After waiting a while, anywhere from 5 seconds up to a minute, they'll reel the bait in a few feet and repeat. This gives us the impression of a dead bait that's a very easy meal for fish and appeals to the most inactive fish in the area. Dead sticking is not a retrieve used to search for fish, but it's better suited for targeting specific pieces of cover where fish might be hiding. When dead sticking, anglers should keep a semi-tight line at all times and watch their line to see if it starts to drift off in one direction, jump, or tighten up, signaling a bite. Alright, one retrieval modifier is the figure 8. This is part of a casting technique that you use at the end of your retrieve to extend the area a fish can chase your bait or lure, or simply extend the cast. This technique is typically used for following fish and is almost exclusively used in musky fishing applications. However, some pike have been known to hit on the figure 8, as well as some smallmouth bass if they are in an extremely hungry mood. To perform a figure 8, reel in your lure or reel in your line until there is slightly more than the leader's length remaining between the tip of your lure and your rod tip. As your lure begins getting close to the boat, ensure your rod tip is pointed straight at the lure. Once the lure is about 2 feet away from the tip of the rod, stop reeling. Begin moving the rod tip in the shape of an 8 beside the boat. Be sure to use the full range of the rod and make gradual corners so that fish following your bait can catch it more easily. Turning too sharp will accelerate your bait and spook off nearby fish, and they won't be able to make that corner as easily. General tips when performing the figure 8 are to slow down on the corners and speed up through the straight sections. However, this may change depending on the mood of the fish. Some additional tips for performing the figure 8 include making the turn away from the boat to prevent hook setting into the side of the boat, which will cause you to miss fish, and the hook and to set the hook away from the boat as well. Other tips are to change the depth throughout the figure 8 and to always perform multiple figure 8s, as muskie can be just out of view and waiting to strike. Just like any other sport, in order to be successful, you need to master the fundamentals. Fishing is no different. While you do not need to be the best caster or fastest lure retriever on the planet to see results, having the different casting and retrieval skills in your back pocket will help you put more fish in the boat. The good news is you do not need to be on the water and fishing to practice these skills. Like any sport, you can complete drills at home to work on your casting accuracy, your distance, and form, which will pay off the next time you hit the water. Congratulations on completing this module and moving one step closer to becoming an exceptional angler. Continue to review the material in this module to solidify your understanding and continue to use it as a reference point for planning your future fishing adventures. Be sure to check out our blog for more fishing tips, tricks, and ideas. The New Wave Fishing Academy offers a number of other training modules to help you become a more successful angler, and we encourage you to continue completing them. New Wave Fishing Academy would like to personally thank you for completing this training module. Our mission has and always will be to help you become a more successful angler by providing you with the knowledge and ability to apply this knowledge to help you catch more fish. In order for us to continue our mission, we need to hear from you. If you have comments, questions, ideas, or want us to prepare a module just for you, do not hesitate to reach out. We will do our best to update our content to give you the best information possible. If you're looking to continue your learning on the water with us, we would be thrilled to book a session. Our thoughts are that there's no better way to learn than by doing, so we offer our lessons while offering you a fishing trip on the world-class fishery of Georgian Bay. We will teach you all you need to know and can tailor your trip to suit your needs. Whether you're looking to target largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, northern pike, walleye, lake trout, or muskie, we can prepare a trip for you. New Wave Fishing Academy operates on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay between Parry Sound and the French River. Looking for a fishing vacation? Reach out and we can hook you up with resorts that will offer you the best chance to meet your fishing goals. Whether you're looking for a remote getaway or drive to cottage, all our recommendations are within a 3 hours drive north of Toronto. Be sure to connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, by phone or email, and at our website. We are always sharing great content, new courses, tips and tricks, and the best catches of our students. New Wave Fishing Academy loves to hear your thoughts, feedback, and questions. If you want to see what the New Wave Fishing team has been up to when we're not providing lessons, check us out on YouTube for our latest fishing adventures and see just what is waiting for you once you unlock your fishing potential.